Thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm in a hallway, so forgive me. I was on the road and just couldn't get back to my office in time, so felt that we just would do the class here. And what I'd like to do today is basically talk about just a couple of things. And that would be essentially what the mission of the Laboratory Response Network is. I want to define what a Sentinel clinical laboratory is. I want to describe the responsibilities of both you in your clinical laboratory and what my responsibility as a person that works at the State Health Lab and what I do. We're going to take a moment and discuss biosafety, although I suspect you've heard a lot of biosafety lately during this COVID pandemic. There's a list of organisms I'll introduce you to that really are the greatest risk, I think even more so than COVID, and we'll talk about those in the following sessions. And then we're going to, with biosafety, just talk briefly about risk assessment. We're going to talk about, when you're talking biosafety, what causes aerosols. And then we're going to talk about the fundamental work practices in each of the biosafety levels. So we'll work through that process. All right, just to kind of get started and give you some background to what the LRN is, the Laboratory Response Network actually is a program that was started back in 1999 by the CDC, but it was in coordination with the Association of Public Health Labs and, believe it or not, the FBI. I think even back in '99, which was before the big anthrax outbreak in 2001, they had suspicion then and very worried about everything they were hearing via rumor that there might be attacks. So I think that's when FBI worked with CDC and NPHL to bring up the Laboratory Response Network. I think they recognized that you as the clinical laboratory realize that you are the basis of our pyramid here. You are the first people that tend to come up and possibly recognize these organisms. And so if you do the rule out and refer procedures, you would more than likely give us a call to let us know that you might have a possible suspicious organism. And if that's the case, we'll have you send it to us and we will look into confirmatory testing. Now, with that, we do on occasion need the help of the CDC to do some testing for us. It obviously is more definitive characterization that they do, but ultimately either they get the report or they get the actual organism. So that's what the LRN is. And with that, the mission of the LRN is that we want to work with our laboratories, no matter where you are internationally, in the United States, in Nebraska. And we want to be able to work with you to teach you how to quickly recognize these organisms. And once you recognize the trigger points, you can respond to them. So through training, rapid testing, timely notification, and secure messaging, we hope that we can get a real heads up on any danger that might be out there. Now, there is several different types of LRN structures. Of course, we've talked a lot about the biological threats that we are looking for anthrax or Francisella or brucella. However, we also are very involved with chemical threats as well. We luckily in the United States have not encountered it very much, but it is definitely something that we are worried about. There are other countries that have been exposed to chemicals in a horrible way, and we're just one of the lucky ones that have not been. All right, and with that, just to give you an idea of the expanse of the LRN, so not only are we involved with each of the states, as you see, some states are larger than others, and therefore they have multiple LRN districts or jurisdictions. And they're also in the outlying states of Alaska, Hawaii, but Australia, South Korea, United Kingdom, Germany, and I think even more now are involved with our LRN program. So the LRN network, as we call it, is ever evolving. It changes every time, I swear, we have a new disease. From swine flu in 2009, and sorry for calling it that, that was not appropriate, but the H1N1, that's when I came onto the scene here at NPHL. And so what we do is we try to work together, always trying to keep communication going. We try to work with you as much as we can, especially on reportable diseases as this. So I guess it goes back to, with that strong relationship, that that primary function is, again, that rapid detection and then also reporting of these select or suspicious agents. So in reality, without the prompt rule out refer that we rely on you as a clinical laboratorian to do, I do think that our response would be in jeopardy. I don't know how else we would get this information if we didn't have you guys there. So let's go ahead and define in detail what a Sentinel Clinical Laboratory is, at least for our terminologies. It isn't just those laboratories that have microbiology. I think that you'll find that their laboratories, and as you know, laboratories are going through major changes recently, and so we always have to review our definition of a Sentinel lab. But for now, it is a laboratory that does in-house testing, keeps the gram stain, and or, I'm going to put the word or in there too, at least one of the following tests. If they do the lower respiratory tract, sputum, bronch, BAL, or if they would do any sterile wound, I'm going to include sterile body fluids and also blood cultures. Blood culture is probably the huge one. And so I find a lot of labs who in rural sites might not have a full-blown microbiology section anymore, but they might still continue to do gram stains and blood cultures. So I do still include them with that particular definition. I think that it is important for those that still do gram stains that you are able to recognize what a possible Bacillus anthracis may look like, what a Francisella would look like in the blood culture. Okay, so let's talk about the roles of each of these. As far as the clinical laboratory, your role, as we mentioned, is you do a variety of critical tests, you provide timely results, and you're the first one to impact patient care, which again is extremely important. So because of that, you are vital to our surveillance, and you do a lot of surveillance for us. You are able to identify some of these novel threats. When you, because of our surveillance programs, we know when some of these more, what's the word, some of these more vicious influenzas come up, not just the seasonal influenza. We see them coming, and of course we report to the CDC right away. Essentially, that's what happened in COVID. Although reports say that, yeah, it wasn't reported right away. However, eventually that word did get out to notify the World Health Organization, the CDC, and once there, obviously, it spread worldwide as far as the communication of what was happening. So we really do want to work strongly with our clinical laboratories and be on the alert and have you report all the notifiable diseases. So we'll talk a little bit about that later on. So some of the primary responsibilities would to be literally to recognize that organism, to do just a few tests to rule it out. If you cannot rule it out, we would ask that you refer. We want you to become familiar with reportable diseases. That is what is called the state's Title 173. We want to make sure that our laboratories maintain the capability and the knowledge to perform testing on these organisms, and hence our training today. We want to make sure that we keep competent in this training. That's why we recommend the laboratory preparedness exercise, which is the LPX. It's not graded, but it gives you a really good idea of what these organisms look like. We also do state challenge, develop some challenge sets, and those particular organisms are only mimic organisms. We never send out the virulent strains. All right, and then obviously there's a few other things that you do, what all normal laboratories do. You maintain a biosafety cabinet, you follow biosafety rules and regulations, you comply with OSHA standards. Many of you are accredited through CAP or COLA. So obviously you have been doing this for a long time. Now, the one thing that clinical laboratories do not have to do that I would as a state laboratory, and that would be to register as a select agent program. Even though you might actually isolate Bacillus anthracis, or you might actually isolate Francisella or a Brucella. That doesn't make you a select agent. It's if you keep the organism that makes you a select agent laboratory. If you're freezing it down and keeping it, you have to keep a log and you have to register with the CDC's select agent program. Now, if you do, even though you aren't registered, if you get the organism, there are several CDC forms to fill out, and they will be sent to you. We will walk you through what to fill out and when to fill out. And then one part of those forms is on making sure that the organism is destroyed or it's sent to us. So it's something where I guess it just assures us that you are no longer keeping that organism in your facility. Now, what is my responsibility as public health lab? It is essentially to maintain a database of all of my clinical laboratories. And I do. I have a Excel program that I use. I do have usually 2 contacts, so when we ask for 2 contacts, that's what I'm doing is asking you to update my database. So we provide training to assure that you are staying competent in some of these areas, but not only do I provide the rule out refer process, I also train in packaging and shipping, and then chain of custody, which is something rarely that people use. And I teach biosafety and risk assessment. As much as possible, I try to integrate it with my classes. Sorry for the wobbliness. Okay. With that, what we want to do is make sure you get good practice too. Sometimes we'll develop exercises, either virtual exercises. We might talk about it on a post challenge set call or LPX call. So it's a matter of working through it. We also want to make sure that we provide 24/7 assistance. We are there. You can call us, page us at our emergency pager any day of the week. We're not necessarily in the office, but we can help you through any possible BT organisms that you might have. So we also want to make sure you have a robust electronic system that will do the reporting, and also we have a robust electronic system that we can communicate with, and that would be our new alert system, and then also our stat pack system. All right. With that, let's keep going. I guess, oops, try again here. All right. All right. So just a review. And again, I think because of the fact that we have been experiencing COVID to the utmost, you have really engaged in self-biosafety. I think that you guys have done a great job to really reflect in what you do with your lab, and to see if it warrants any additional PPE. And essentially that's what you're doing, is a risk assessment. So what is biosafety? Really, it's just a combination of work practices, primary containment devices, those things in your laboratory, like a centrifuge, and even the laboratory design is all very meticulously done in order to reduce the risk of laboratory infection, or to prevent the release of microbial organisms into the environment. I always share the story of why it's important. This is a true story that I had read about, in where a very healthy microbiologist had been working in a research laboratory. Unfortunately, did come down with headache, fever, neck pain, and stiffness. And of course, he just probably thought it was a cold or flu coming on. But by the next morning, he was extremely sick, transported to the hospital. And in fact, the hospital that he worked at, and when he was on his way to the hospital, he lost consciousness. So the physician, of course, in the ER recognized the petechia, suspected some sort of meningococcus, and was treated with antibiotic. Unfortunately, even at the age of 25, this particular researcher developed respiratory arrest. They tried resuscitation, but unsuccessful. He was declared 3 hours later. I mean, why does something like this happen? And was his death preventable? And yes, it was. Um, Obviously, OSHA is going to be involved when there is a death like this in a laboratory. And upon investigation, they discovered that there were multiple breaches in this laboratory, that the researcher was working with Neisseria meningitidis in the open bench. Now, granted, that was 8 years ago, and we think, oh, well, we're so much better, but I don't know. I still worry about the things that we work with in the open bench and if we're doing them carefully enough. Now, this particular researcher was not offered the quadrivalent vaccine, even though they knew he was working with virulent Neisseria meningitidis. Also, he had no training. And of course, the PI in that project was cited for 3 citations simply because of lack of training, lack of safety. So it's important that for our health and well-being that we follow all biosafety standards and keep up with them. That's the problem. We rely on supervisors, and sometimes I think ourselves, we need to be just as boisterous about our safety. Another situation that happened that really hit close to home was salmonella outbreak. And it was actually an ATCC organism that everybody keeps as quality control organisms in their laboratory. And it literally affected 109 people in 38 states. It is the type Miriam. Sorry about that, the salmonella type Miriam strain that seemed to get out. So how does this happen? How do family members get sick even though they have not been in that laboratory? Probably because something was brought home. So even if it was on your purse or a contaminated lab coat, if you bring your lab coats home. I don't think that happens anymore. But think about the scrubs that you wear. Is it something that is washed right away or not? Even more importantly, how about the pens or the cell phones that are done? It's important to keep in mind what you're using in your laboratory, making sure that none of that leaves the laboratory. So unfortunately, and I'm just as guilty, I have pens that have been brought home and Sharpies that I know came from the lab. So they accidentally get into pockets, into purses, and most importantly, the cell phones. I know that it is a hardship sometimes not to have your cell phone in the laboratory. I know laboratories who totally turn their face to having people talking on the phone in the lab. If you absolutely have to have your phone in there, talk to your children about working with them to just, call or text. You can go wash your hands, go out to someplace safe, and then call them back. It is not safe to have a cell phone in the laboratory, especially when you take that cell phone home. All right, so what are the greatest risks to the microbiologist? Obviously, Brucella, by the sheer numbers alone, is the most important. And that's comparing Brucella to, let's say, what normal general population will get, because it's in concentrated form in the laboratory, and because it becomes aerosolized very easily, then laboratorians are over 600 times more likely to come down with Brucella. There are things that have been spread quite easily is Neisseria meningitidis. Even as we saw in that example earlier, 24 hours. We have seen Mycobacterium tuberculosis, rarely, but we've seen it. Some people do even seroconvert, and so that's very important too. And last but not least, I think that Salmonella and Shigella are definitely organisms to be careful of. Those of you who work on the bench, if you do any stool work, those can be very dangerous organisms to work with. All right. So how do we prevent laboratory acquired infections? Obviously, it is all about the biosafety. The important part is that you must remember every day that you work in a very hazardous environment. You don't want to become complacent. You want to think tirelessly about each step that you do. So really, a lot of studies on laboratory-acquired infections show no difference in age, length of employment, years of education. Somebody who maybe started 2 weeks ago is at the same risk as me, who's been working way too many years in the laboratory. What we do know is this, that 30% of laboratories acknowledge that they breached that safety regulation, that like they were trying to skip out early for lunch. And we all know too well we don't get our lunches on a timely basis, if at all. So, or we wanted we've got 2 phone calls and we're hurrying through a gram stain or a setup or something like that. So unfortunately, we just need to take our time. Things like that will have to wait, and we have to think again through every step. We've also known through studies that 36% of accidents that happen in the laboratory is when people, like I said, do work too quickly. They need to get out, they need to get home to get their kids out of daycare, and so it's a rushed situation. They do know also that only 16% of all laboratory-acquired infections are documented. And the CDC has never really figured out a good way, although they ask for people to report these. It can even be done anonymously. But I think people are sometimes very leery to tell their supervisor, afraid that they might get dinged on their evaluation. It doesn't make sense, but at that particular time, they have their job to worry about. So you shouldn't be afraid. You should be in a setting in which all laboratorians feel very comfortable to say, hey, this happened today. I want to share this because I don't want it to happen to anybody else. So what we do know too is that of the 80% of exposures to aerosols, that's probably the cause of some of these sources of infection. It's unconfirmed, but it's very suspicious that it's an aerosol that caused the problem. Okay, so what do we know about aerosols? And we've talked about these before. You know the common sneeze, the classic sneeze where particles can be thrown out 6 feet in front of us, hence the 6-foot rule, right? However, let's look at what we do in the laboratory. We do usually spit out or blow out the last drop in our pipettes, even if you're using a pipette holder of some sort. Hopefully you haven't used the Bunsen burner for a long time, but we do vortex. We vortex on the bench top. So hope that all of you by now have worked into your safety rules that any vortexing on the bench top has to be done with a closed and tight cap. If you have to vortex without a cap, then it has to be in the biosafety cabinet. And last but not least, the thing that we do quite often with blood cultures is aspirating a ml or 2 of blood. And as we know, gram-negative rods can produce quite a bit of gas production, and what happens as you're entering or exiting that particular vial that's positive, you might get a spray back, and you may not see it at all. However, it's there, so we do not ignore it. We know that every time you do a blood culture that you should be very conservative in exactly how you work in the biosafety cabinet, that you probably work from dirty to clean, things like that, and then that you take off your gloves as you exit, every time you exit the biosafety cabinet. So you don't want to work with that bottle and then have to leave the biosafety cabinet because you forgot something, or you get a phone call and with those same gloves simply talk on the phone. That's just the worst way possible. Sometimes I think gloves can also be a culprit in themselves because people don't change them enough. If you have bare skin, you actually realize that you've got something wet on your hands, and that's the first thing you'll do is go wash your hands. So just listing some of the things that emit aerosols, those in red are the ones that we probably do in the microbiology lab. And I think the ones that are most guilty are the catalase, the vortexing, and let's see, anything else. Even just the manipulation of touching the colony with your loop. Can be, especially if your loop's still a little hot. So to prevent aerosolization, that's the thing you want to look through. You want to think about what you're doing, and is there a way to prevent that? Can we move the vortexing into the biosafety cabinet? Can we not blow out the pipette tip at the very end? Do we have to figure out a different way of pipetting? Spills, obviously we want everybody to know what to do if there's a spill. Even inoculating plates, you want to do it carefully. And if you suspect one of these organisms, that you should be working in the biosafety cabinet. Catalase tests, that's something we do every day that we work on the open bench. Now, am I saying that you have a strep or a staph and that you have to go to the biosafety cabinet every time? No, but do remember that if you're putting it right up to your eyes, you can watch for those bubbles. Think of how close it is to your face. So it's definitely something that you want to rethink in how you do these tests. Now, let's talk a little bit about the different practices. I know that in our biosafety level, we have what is called the BSL, which is your biosafety level 3 practice. Very restricted, double door entry or lock. We wear full PPE, possibly even a PAPR. We do a lot of training. We do a lot of exercises. We do man down exercises. We do spill exercises. That's something I don't think that we did in the clinical lab sufficiently. And I think it would behoove us in the clinical lab to do more exercises too as well. The new terminology, which I think you may have heard recently, is talking about using BSL-3 practices in a BSL-2 laboratory. And what that means is when you don't have all the capabilities of working up something and you don't have a BSL-3 lab, then how can you work it up as safely as possible? And that is something that usually a laboratory director will determine. Hopefully they work one-on-one with each of you two, either in training or being a part of that risk assessment, so everybody's aware of the risks to them as they work. All right, so obviously the important thing is that when there's aerosols, you do need to protect your mucous membranes. So yes, we've been protecting our mucous membranes by wearing a mask. We've been protecting our eyes by safety shields or plastic shields. But you know, our nose, is it protected? If you're only wearing goggles, you've got to think through these things. Okay, there are resources to help you make those decisions. I really happen to like the one that was published in 2012, the guidelines for safe work practices in the diagnostic laboratories. Much more easy to read. But the official one, the Bible, as they call it, is the biosafety in the microbiological or biomedical laboratory, which is in book form itself, whereas MMWR simply published the first one as just a very large article. So I recommend that you keep those in your laboratory. I wanted to hit upon risk assessment and just some of the key principles. As we know, the process enables us to make the decisions about what to do and what not to do, and how to work with containment to make sure that everybody's safe. So I won't go through this today. I'm hoping that all of you got some real hands-on risk assessment training when it came to COVID, thinking through each of the steps. What is aerosolized when you did your kit test? What organisms or what cultures might be most at risk to have COVID. So these are the types of steps that you follow through when you perform a risk assessment. Here's a nice example of a risk assessment. Here what we're trying to show is that a risk assessment is not the same thing as your IQCP that is required for inspections. It actually goes beyond the IQCP requirements and asks you to pick out each step and what is dangerous to that step, and then how you're going to mitigate the step. So if you look at blood cultures, you can say, okay, now this is how I set up a blood culture, this is how I inoculate it, this is how I get a positive, and what I do to that positive. So what are some of the hazards? I vortex, I centrifuge, I do gram stains. There is a possibility of spill. Is there possible TB in it? Well, yes. Then if it is, what's required? What are the minimum and maximum safety rules that you're going to do? So I'm not going to, belabor that anymore, but I hope you guys got all good practices. So just a quick review to what biological safety levels are. Here's a great chart that really walks through each of those, and I'll go a little bit more in depth than the BSL 1, 2, and 3. BSL 4, however, is what our biocontainment, Ebola biocontainment facility was at the university. So let's just start with the easiest one. Obviously, biosafety level 1 is just what you might see in a high school lab. Obviously, you're working with known organisms, and they teach the basics about washing hands and working with organisms and some of the PPE. So those are the requirements, the practices that are required in a BSL laboratory. I make the comment that even in your home setting, when you're making bread, making wine or beer. You're working with live yeast, so you yourself have a BSL-1 laboratory right in your kitchen. All right, now, jaunting up to BSL-2, actually that's quite a jump, because if you think about you're working in the BSL-1, you know what organism is there, versus biosafety level 2, which is what the clinical lab is, and that you work with organisms day in, day out, and you're not sure what's in that specimen. You're not sure if there's TB or Ebola or just staph or strep. So we teach everything and use universal precautions to treat everything the same. And that's why we go through the bloodborne diseases, why we use extreme precautions when it comes to sharps and such. So what we do, the biosafety levels tend to compound. So you take all those requirements of BSL-1 and you add to it a few more things. Under the BSL-2, it would be then you have lockable doors, safety cabinets being installed, eye washes, airflow that is not recirculated and separate from public areas. Ventilation is directional, so very distinct airflows. All right.
Hello.
Hello.
How are you?
Good. And then what we do is add even more requirements to the BSL-3. And the BSL-3 is used for those situations where it is a hazardous organism, possibly even lethal. So if you think about the organisms that we in the state lab use, TB, Bacillus anthracis, the E. coli 0157. Those we do in a BSL-3 level. And of course, you work with it too. You do some identification with it for us. So it's certainly important to remember that you should be using BSL-3 precautions, even though you are in a BSL-2 laboratory. So again, compounding the BSL adds compounding doors in isolated zones. Air filtration is even more detailed, so many exchanges per minute, walls, floors, all those things are down to the detail to make everything permeate or wash cleanable and not to trap organism. A lot of times in BSL-3s, we do use a lot of face protection, something that protects all parts of our face and all mucous membranes. And some of the things we recommend to even in a BSL-2 setting is to open up your centrifuges and take those rotors and literally before you open them up, put them in a biosafety cabinet in it and open those rotors there so that if there's any aerosolization that of course it's caught there in the biosafety cabinet and not spewing out at you. All right. So lab personnel in a BSL-3, obviously they go through a lot more strict guidelines, strict training. Every little incident is reported and we all participate in medical surveillance, sometimes more than others, especially if when we were working with Ebola. Obviously we were doing our bio levels twice a day. Okay. All right, so just to review that there are things that are conducted in a BSL-2 laboratory which requires practices and procedures that typically are found in a BSL-2, but unfortunately, you don't have that true full containment level, so you have to do as much as you can to protect yourself, and that might mean more PPE, working more slowly, and more methodically. All right, I do want to take a moment to review PPE. I know you've done it a million times, but I want to make sure that people are very conscious when they take off their gloves. They just don't take them, grab them, and let them and throw them into the trash. That you would consciously go underneath the first glove and either use the beak method or slowly remove it. And then with your sterile hand, go ahead and, oh, I'm sorry, other way around. Let me start over. So yes, when you're the first hand, you would grab the center of the glove because that's contaminated area. Pull that off, and then with your sterile hand, pull the other off. So my apologies, but make it a conscious effort. So obviously, when you put them on, you would go by putting them on with your glove, then your mask, then over your mask, you put your face shield, and your gloves last. What's even more important is dofting, because they show about 40 to 60% of all laboratory infections can also come from just dofting. And therefore, you would want to put your glove and gowns on first, or take your glove and gowns off first. Then remove your face shield, then your respirator, and then each of those steps, there could be either full hand washing or possibly using hand sanitizer before you go on to the next step. I know with Ebola, we did actually require some sort of hand sanitizing before you took the next item off. So very important. Again, biosafety is extremely important, not only obviously for our safety, but it is part of our CLIA requirements or other criteria which we follow. So in our inspections, they are asked if they have protocols to recognize and handle safely isolates that might be used, isolates of organisms used as bioterrorisms, but in reality, these organisms, we have them here in Nebraska just as well. We want you to understand what our response is and who you contact when you identify one of these or suspect one of these organisms. And obviously, we want you to know what to do in case of a spill. All right, just to kind of slowly go through these or to wrap these up at the last minute here, biosafety cabinets. Do know how they work because there's 3 types of classes. You will need a class 2 biosafety cabinet. Go look, because there's a little small silver sign on the side that'll say biosafety class 2, 2A, or 2B, depending upon how the air is exhausted. But as you know, the air is taken down to the front of the biosafety cabinet when you're working in it. Then it's taken around to the back and circulated through the HEPA filter even before it gets into the cabinet. So it is sterile. That air is sterile even as you're working to protect your cultures from it and protect them. All right. So I think that I'll just quickly mention that there's a definite way to work with the biosafety cabinet. Let it run for a couple of minutes, work from dirty to clean, watch for disruptions, make sure nobody's walking close to the biosafety cabinet. And then when done, make sure that you exit and immediately doff your gloves every time, even if you need to run out and get one thing, doff those gloves. All right. So when is biosafety cabinet required? Obviously, when anything that emits aerosols, anything that's been centrifuged, if you're inoculating, any plate has to be done in the biosafety cabinet. I know some people kind of fudge on urines. They might not necessarily do the urines in the biosafety cabinet, but all other specimens should be. So also when you are working on the bench, you happen to notice you might have a gram-negative coccobacilli or a diplococci or large gram-positive rods seen in the direct gram stain. That's a blaring hint or trigger point. You might have something suspicious. Any slow growth is, any really rapid growth is. And so that's when we will want to start to consider doing a rule out and refer practice. All right, so I think most of you can tell that where's Waldo in this picture? Obviously it's too cluttered. The grill is blocked. The back vents are blocked because there's too much stuff in it. And also the disposals on the inside, that's probably the hardest one to find. Excuse me, the disposal is not inside. So the disposal's underneath the chair there. So that means you have to reach in and out every time to dispose of something. That's not right. So, okay, so obviously all these goals are meant for something. And again, it's just to prevent laboratory acquired infections. We can't stress enough to keep your hands away from your face. I really find that as I wear my mask more and more, that it keeps me from touching my lips, my nose, my face. I just need something to keep me from touching my eyes now. And obviously, avoid using personal items in lab and vice versa. Do not sniff plates. Work up all TB and fungal, obviously, in the BSL-3 setting. And make sure that your centrifuged specimens are opened up in the biosafety cabinet. So that's all I have today that I wanted to go through. And I know that was a pretty sheer review for everybody, but it's the baseline that we need in order to get into session 2 and session 3, which we will do next week at noon. So thank you, everyone. And I didn't see one thing come out of the chat box. Does anybody have any questions? All right. Hearing none, I might just let it go at that. And if you're just too shy, feel free to email me later. I'd be happy to answer any questions. So with that, we're going to really get into the trigger points next week, especially positives. And then, oh, your chat's disabled. Sorry, Hannah. You're welcome if you have your phone to go off mute or just email me later. How's that? So, all right. Thank you, everyone, and have a great day, a great afternoon. Bye-bye now.